Okay, so what we're going to do today is go over keying a bit, and I've got a couple of clips that I gave you, and we're going to pop up After Effects, and actually pop After Effects down. Let me open this guy up. So I've got this background image, and I've got a green screen here, and I'm going to pop up After Effects, and I'm just alt-tabbing through to this guy, and I'm dragging this into After Effects. So now that After Effects knows about that, and I'll tab that and come over to projects, and I've got these two guys here. To set up the project, since it's an HD project, I'm just going to grab my clip here, the movie file, and drag that down to my timeline. And we've got this guy sitting here. What this actually, we're imagining he's sitting in a tent and he's looking outside into the environment, or he's sitting with his back to the opening of the tent. What this actually was a setup they had down in the directing stage, sort of an independent project for, I think it was a PBS thing about mothers talking about their children, but they had this green screen set up, and I had a couple of minutes between, they had like 40 mothers coming in talking about their families, and I had like 5 minutes between one set of mothers to shoot, and this guy was a student who was sitting there, and so I had to sit behind the camera. So here, this is a green screen that's lit, and this is like a cord hanging down from a cord hanging down from the camera, but the illusion I think will be recreated pretty well. And then I've got this background image, lawn care. I'm going to drop in back here. And if I mute out my foreground, you'll see, because this is a much smaller image, and I created the project based off of the HD image, you can manually scale this up, but if you do Control Alt and F at the same time with that selected, it'll blow up anything or shrink it down to fit the size of the composition. So that's the hotkey is Control Alt and F. And we're going to pop him back up. So there's a million different ways to do, there's a million different techniques for doing keying. Part of the knowing what you're getting into ahead of time would be, one, knowing what they shot this on. I used a Canon 7D, which is creates a compressed QuickTime file. It's actually the H.264 codec. What that means is this is a compressed file. I don't know if we go in far enough, if we can see anything. Not yet. Now, once you key it, yeah, I can't see much here. Once it, yeah, you can't up on the monitor. Once I key it, you'll probably see some blockiness. I'll point out some blockiness of the compression artifacting. But the ideal when you're working with green screens would be to work with uncompressed material. The problem is with high definition, the amount of data for uncompressed material is like, a 10-second clip might be a couple of gigabytes. And so you're talking huge amounts of storage for this stuff, and by and large the industries come up with different compression schemes for it. The problem with compression and keying is that what most compressions do, here let me see, I'm just going to throw this on, throw a keyer up here real quick, effect, keying, key light, and just pop up in here. And then look at the mat. Yeah, that one. See if I can find an area. Of course not when I'm looking for it. If you go in far enough, okay, it's like this noisy area here, and you'll see this on your own screens a little bit easier. Some of these pixels. They're all irregular shaped, and they're not just uniform square pixels. And what that is a compression, because what compression is actually doing is looking at all the pixels, and when it finds an area of pixels that are pretty close to the same color, they average them together to make one bigger pixel. And that's one method of compression. And what happens is that those bigger chunks sometimes it's hard to not get jagged edges around the edges of your mats and stuff. It's just much harder for the keyer to work with. I'm going to reset this back. But anyway, that's what we have to do with most of the keyers now are good enough so that you can get a reasonable quality, but the better the less the compression, the better off you are. So anyway, we've got this guy here, and basically the camera's handheld, so he's just sort of bouncing around there. I'm just going to work off the first frame here. And the first thing you may want to do is the default After Effects layout has the info button up, info information up here, and as the cursor goes over the image, you'll see the values for the red, green, and blue all change. And this is all 8-bit information, if you remember from the other day. So 8-bit equals 0 to 254 for red, green, and blue. So when you look at these numbers, you're looking at up here. You're looking at the values on any particular pixel of the red, green, and blue together. So you can see green is way higher than the other two colors. But you also see that as you move around the cursor, the area, that the green values change. That one's, what is that, 132 down there, 117 up there, 132. So what it means is that it's not perfectly evenly lit. It's a little bit darker up here than down here, which is why it was getting kind of noisy here. So what I kind of like to do is, seeing that kind of range, is I'll try keying from a couple of different areas just to see. Like if I key down here, and with the key light, this is going to put you in the different modes of the key light. And what you want at this point would be, instead of the final result, if you look at screen mat, it'll show you the raw alpha channel, the mat that's being created from the keyer. And you'll see I click down here, and that's pretty, not perfectly, but it's pretty black. There's still a lot of stray pixels, but it gets a lot whiter up here. And with keyers, white is opaque and black is transparent, and this area here is definitely not black, and with all these pixels that you can see kind of moving around as you move it, that's all noise that would be flickering and causing all sorts of buzzing in your key. So I'm going to try and find a place that works a little better than that as far as a place to pick from. So let's try over here. I'm going to come up over here. And screen mat. You see this area is darker. And we're kind of holding the hair pretty good, but we still got issues way over here. Some of this, there's other controls that I'll be going over that help with this. But let's come in, since this seems to be the problem area here, let's just pick up here and see what we get. See, by picking by knowing where to pick from, so basically the darker area up here, I'm getting much less pixel contamination, and it's still pulling it out over here. It's still pretty well jet black here, and we're still holding the hair reasonably well. Got some issues here. There's actually a bunch of stray gray pixels here, but we're going to fix that. So I'm going to stay with that decision to pick from right up in this area here and get my green value there. This is showing you the chip, and that if you open that up, this is actually the color green that was selected. Sometimes you can adjust this a little bit. Right. And clean it up a little bit that way.
Yeah, I did a 3D layer.
I turned it off.
Okay.
I saw that. Okay, so that's starting to work out pretty good. There's still straight pick. We got to clean it up a bit, but we're still we got some room to work here. So first thing I found with this particular clip, you got controls, you got screen gain, which is what we were using the other day with Tyler, that seemed to work. But I found with this particular clip, if I use the screen gain, I can just take a touch out there. Let's see what that does to the hair. When you get into keying, if you've got hair or you got anything that's like flyaway, fuzzy, semi-transparent, those are the kind of things that you really got to be careful of, because if you key it the wrong way, it starts looking like you just cut it out of a magazine and you cut all the hair off, or you stick a football helmet on the person and cut all their hair off based on that. It just gets rid of all this, the soft edges and stuff. See if I see what's happening if I crank it up like that. And I'm going to pop this back to 50, no, 100, where it was. Thank you. And sometimes screen gain works. Other times I found this actually, I try to stay away from black clip, but in this, which is all these controls that are under the screen mat here, you can clip out the blacks, you can clip out the whites. I'll show you what rollback does. You can grow your mat and shrink it, you can soften it. I tend to stay away from the D spots, they don't buy a whole lot for me. Let's just pop in here. I know it's a little bit hard to see. You'll see it on the video, but it's harder to see on the screen. But there's stray pixels here, and I'm just going to open up the clip, the black clipper a little bit, and just touch it a little bit, take out those pixels, and then come over and see how our hair is doing. One way to test with the hair would be to come back and let's see, switch to the source. And you're not going to get everything held, because you get out to these stray strands, they're green, and if you're telling it to remove green, that's the real battle, is to try and keep as much as you can, but you're not going to get the very tips because they're actually green. But I can sort of switch between that and the screen mat, and you can kind of see where that's dropping off. Or if I go to the final result and even block this off, like I said, it's a little bit harder for you to see. I can go to the source and then go to the final result, and you'll see how much you're losing or not losing back here, like so. And let's pop that back on. And I think I'm going to live with that for now. It's holding up pretty well around the edges here, like so. Alright. Alright, so we've got that. Let's see, clip, the rollback. If I come back in here, let's go back to the screen mat. Rollback, a lot of times you'll adjust it and you won't see a whole lot happening, but what it's actually good for is actually adjusting the grays in areas that are sort of semi-transparent, like these strands of the hair. And you can see that by just grabbing the rollback and using the see how it's kind of growing it back out. So it's sort of pushing a little more back of the semi-transparent fuzziness back into this. All of these sliders you can either just use as a virtual slider and just click and drag. If you click right on it, you can type in a number. Or if you open it up, you get a little bit bigger slider here. So I tend to use. See, there's a very kind of narrow range where this rollback works, but it does kind of help specific for areas around hair, strands of hair and stuff like that. That's really what it was designed for. Okay, so let's see what we got here. Let's come back up here and just look at the final result. Alright. So we still got some issues. A lot of transparency here. This is actually defocused something, so that stays. But if I look back at my mat, see there's all these stray pixels in here. So there's a trick you can use called generating a core mat. Right now this mat, the one I've got here, I'm using to sort of define the edges. But I want to get rid of all this stuff here. So if I take this keyer and this layer and just do a Control D and duplicate it, now I've just made a copy of it. They're identical, same effects, everything that's on there. And I'm going to come down to the one, not the one on the top, that's going to stay as the one for my edges, but the one in the middle here of these three layers, I'm going to make a core mat. So what I'm going to do is turn off my top layer, which is using the little eyeball here. And so now I'm just looking at this layer and the background layer here. I've turned this one off. And you can see that's even, I've still got this one set to screen mat. So that's one way to tell which one you're looking at. So let's come back down here and open up and just make sure that I'm using that key light. And what I'm going to do is bring up my screen mat and actually start cranking things a lot. So the first thing is I stayed away from clipping the whites, but what the white clipper does, if I bring this down, is it starts, you can see it starts painting, basically making all the semi-transparents, pushing them up to white. And I'm just going to crank this way down. What it also does is mess up, the edges of the hair and stuff too. So that's why I don't want to use it, as my main source. But I'm going to crank this down like that. And just so I've got all these hard white areas here. What really happens when you crank the clipper down is that you're narrowing the number of steps between black and white with the white clipper. Same with the black, it's just coming up from the bottom instead of the top. But if I take this out too far, you see how hard-edged that mat gets? Especially around the hair, and soft edges and stuff. When you really clip it like that, you can say, yeah, it's a nice black and white image, but what you're really doing, let's see, boom, is basically getting rid of all the stray strands and fuzziness and just making this really hard edge. So it really starts looking like your sort of standard weatherman, just a quick hard weatherman. Throw them in front of a screen. See how he's starting to look like you just cut him out of a magazine? Right. It's just not right. See? If you go all the way down, you just invert it. But that's with no clipper, no white clipper. And you see all that soft, fuzzy, semi-transparent stuff is just getting lopped right off. Which is no good if you're really trying to make this look real versus just cutting them out of a magazine and making a collage. Of course, if that's what you're trying to do, feel free to do this, but that's not the point of this lesson. So anyway, let's go back to the screen mat. And I'm going to crank this way down, like so. And then I'm going to shrink it. This is another way. Shrink and grow here, values are actually in pixels, and so you're just making it larger and smaller in pixels. And what this actually does is contract or expand your mat. Where it's also used quite a bit is to, if you have a little bit of this screen softness, which is a blurring of the edge of the mat, you can you blur the edges a little bit, and then you shrink it and pull it back underneath, and you can sort of clean up the edges, especially if you get a really badly compressed type of material, and these edges are all sort of chunky and cut out and aliased looking. You can kind of try and fix it with the screen softness and then the shrink and the grow, but it's generally a band-aid. It's not really, you're not going to get real good results doing that, but if you do it subtly, you can sometimes make something that's marginal acceptable. So what I've done is actually shrink this guy down, and you see I'm really not worried about the edges of anything at all. What I'm doing is trying to just create the part of the map that's going to fill in the centers. And Gesundheit. And then I'm going to pull the clipper back down again, so I get rid of this kind of semi-gray pooling here, that stuff. And I also, one thing with After Effects you got to be careful of when you're working with the layers is that it's very easy to click on a layer and just do this and offset, do a transform. And if you do find that, usually the clue is that you start seeing the background layer sort of floating around the edges there. Or if you really, if you look at the transforms, you'll see the position numbers have changed. Quick way to fix that, if you recognize that, is just to hit reset on the transform, and it'll plop it back. You probably will all do that. I'd still do it. Everybody does it. It's a nuance of the software. The key is to recognize that you did do it and fix it, or if you come back tomorrow or you're working on somebody else's project and they did it, that you recognize the issue and just know you just hit reset on the transform. So anyway, now that I've done this, if I turn my other mat on, let's see, go up here, core mat. Oh yes, and let's put this back to final result. So now I basically am compositing the two mats on top of each other, and if I look at, I'm using Alt and hitting this guy, and let's see, what do I got here? Composition, this, solo. Oh, final result. One thing you have to be careful of is when you start comping all this stuff is remembering the keyers and what mode you put them in, because they will kind of fake you out. So what just happened, if I now look at both of these together, see how it's cleaned up all the inside here? So I'm going to step through this because this is an area that does get a bit confusing to start with. But I've now created a key. Basically, I've got this layer, which has got my hair, and then I've created the core mat underneath. And when you put the two of them comped together, you can kind of fill in all the areas and still keep the edges, and get rid of all the pixels in the middle. And then if we look at this and pop this back to RGB, see? And we also got rid of all the semi-transparency and stuff that's happening around through here. So it's a one way of giving you a, it's a technique that just comping several of the keyers with the mats emphasized in different areas. It gives you a way of building up a main mat that has separate controls for like the edges and the centers and stuff like that. Okay, just to sort of step through what I did again, since I think that was a little confusing. I'm going to...
Should you stop recording?
Thank you. Thank you. Let me stop the recording.